Hello, welcome on this MA course titled East Meets West, Connections and Convergences in Cold War and Post-Cold War Europe. My name is Machtel Venke. I'm a professor of contemporary transnational history at the Center for Contemporary and Digital History of the University of Luxembourg. And our guest lecturer today is Dr. Adelina Stefan, who will give a guest lecture titled Tourist Convergences in the Cold War, the Case of Franco's Spain and Socialist Romania. Her lecture examines how international tourism brought about similar developments in Socialist Romania and Franco's Spain during the 1960s and 1970s, despite their location on different sides of the Iron Curtain and their opposite political regimes. Adelina Stefan is a postdoctoral researcher at the Luxembourg Centre for Contemporary and Digital History. She is a historian of 20th century Eastern and Southern Europe with a particular interest in the cultural history of the Cold War, tourism and consumption. Previously, she was a Humanities Initiative Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at the Central European University in Budapest and a research associate in the Department of History and Civilisation at the European University Institute in Florence. She holds a PhD in history from the University of Pittsburgh in the US. Her book manuscript, tentatively titled Vacationing in Dictatorships, Foreign Tourists to Socialist Romania and Francoist Spain in the 1960s and 1970s, examines how international tourism brought about a bottom-up liberalisation in the two dictatorships as it altered ordinary people's lifestyles and material culture.
The topic of today's lecture is tourist convergences in the Cold War, the case of Francoist Spain and Socialist Romania. In today's world, we are very familiar with the mass phenomenon of tourism. We all go on holidays or visit other countries. The phenomenon of mass vacations is not as new as one might assume. It developed during the 20th century and underwent a real boost during the second half of the century, which was also marked by a historic phenomenon known as the Cold War. But what exactly was this so-called Cold War? This is a term used to describe the ideological conflict between the United States and the USSR and their respective allies after the Second World War until roughly 1989. An extensive literature has been published on the Cold War that ranges from examining mainly the military and political tensions between the two superpowers, the United States and the USSR, to more inclusive studies that came to explore, among others, the smaller players in the Cold War, like European countries, but also the role of the emerging Global South in shaping the post-war period. Hence, nowadays, we are accustomed to use terms such as the Global Cold War or an international history of a Cold War that refers to the Cold War as a global phenomenon that involved not just military conflicts and political and economic tensions, although there were quite a few of these too, but also competition, cooperation and transfers between the two main players, the capitalist and socialist blocs. One influential book in this respect is The Cold War, A World History by Odd Arne Westad, published in 2017, which argues that the bipolar system in place after 1945 stemmed from the global transformations of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with the rise of the United States as a global player after the World War I and with the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 that crystallized the ideological division between capitalism and socialism. Overall, Westad's goal is to understand how the conflict between socialism and capitalism influenced and was influenced by global developments on a grand scale. This sort of perspective takes us from a rather provincializing view of a Cold War as the main event of a post-war period and places it within the broader developments of this time period, decolonization, economic growth, or internationalization of world politics. As our focus in today's lecture is Europe, we should try to zoom in and to understand what the Cold War meant for this region. First of all, as you may know, following the Second World War, Europe was divided between the socialist Eastern Europe and capitalist Western Europe, separated by an Iron Curtain, as Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, mentioned in a speech from March 1946 in Fulton, Missouri, United States. While in the late 1940s and early 1950s, Europe was indeed firmly separated into two blocks. As of mid to late 1950s, cultural, economic, and political contacts between the two halves of the continent were resumed. For instance, in 1956, Romania, a socialist country in Eastern Europe, took part in the World Exhibition organized in Brussels, as it wanted to promote world peace and collaboration between nations. In their country presentation, Romanian authorities underlined the increasing number of economic and cultural collaborations that Romania had with countries around the world, regardless of their economic and political system. The 1956 World Exhibition was in fact one of the first events after the onset of the Cold War in the late 1940s to bring together countries from both capitalist and socialist blocs. This event mirrored the new geopolitical situation that followed after the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, the Geneva Convention in 1955, when the leaders of the Big Four, United States, Great Britain, Soviet Union, and France began a dialogue about world peace, and the peaceful coexistence policy that Nikita Khrushchev, the Secretary General of the Communist Party in the USSR, advocated as of 1956. This policy replaced the more tense relations and the open military competition between the USSR and the United States that characterized the last years of Joseph Stalin's rule. International tourism, too, came to play a role in the East-West rapprochement as of mid-1950s. In 1956, at the meeting of tourist delegates from Comecon countries in Varna, Bulgaria, the socialist states decided to relax travel regulations among them, while in 1961, at a similar meeting in Moscow, it was stated that socialist countries could become attractive for Western tourists as well. Similarly, socialist states in Eastern Europe began to participate in international exhibitions that promoted tourism and sold tourist packages across Europe. For instance, one of Romania's first such presentation booths was at a tourist exhibition organized in Luxembourg as early as 1958. While it is difficult to assess how many vacations Romania sold in the aftermath of that respective tourist fair, if any, what is certain is that Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and even USSR became familiar presences at such events as of early 1960s. The main attraction point in these countries was the seaside or the Balaton Lake in Hungary, which to a certain extent came to compete with the beach tourism in Spain, a destination that was in the same price range. A recently declassified document in the CIA archive offers insightful information on the package tours available to US citizens in Eastern Europe, along with prices and entry visa requirements for each country. The 18 days package tours started in Czechoslovakia and would cover destinations in the GDR, Romania, USSR, Yugoslavia, Albania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Poland, and went as far as China. The CIA document praised the quality of tourist services in Czechoslovakia with, I quote, well-equipped hotels and tourist homes, end quote. Again, there is no clear evidence how many American tourists took these trips to Czechoslovakia and Eastern Europe in 1958, but this document is important because it shows that international tourism from capitalist West towards socialist East became possible in the late 1950s, and also that at least Czechoslovakia did meet the standards of American tourists. In the beginning, tourism to socialist countries was rather limited, with people in the West traveling out of curiosity or because of ideological closeness. But already in 1965, the number of Western tourists to Eastern Europe, Soviet Union included, reached 2.7 million, while in 1971 it soared to 4.6 million. The growth of Western tourism to Eastern Europe was part of the expansion of mass tourism throughout the 1950s and the 1960s in Europe and the United States. In the 1950s, it was the well-to-do American tourists who traveled to Europe, especially Western Europe. But with the consolidation of a welfare state in Western and Northern Europe, tourists from these countries started to take vacations as well. The number of European tourists increased from 30 million in 1955 to 100 million in 1966. Significantly enough, in 1970, the number of West German tourists exceeded that of American tourists in Europe for the first time after the Second World War. What also changed during this time was the tourists' social makeup. Whereas in the 1950s, tourists were still the elites, as of the late 1950s, white and blue-collar workers began traveling for vacation in high numbers as well. How and why did this happen? There were three aspects that led to this. First of all, paid vacations became a generalized practice in Europe. All European states offered at least 2 weeks of paid annual leave, while Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and France even granted 4 weeks. Second, a new mentality that linked taking vacations and sunbathing to a healthy lifestyle made most Northern Europeans want to travel to sunnier destinations. Third, vacations became more affordable with the introduction of charter flights and package tours in the 1960s. As French sociologist Jean Viard put it in his Penser les vacances, in the late 1960s, not leaving one's home to go on vacation had become a sign of, I quote, social maladjustment almost as strong as the refusal to work. The norm of vacationing quickly became an obligation, end quote. So, what sort of destinations these tourists sought? Most of the tourists from Western and Northern Europe were looking for sunny and inexpensive destinations that were located in either Southern or Eastern Europe. Against this backdrop, both Spain and Romania developed their tourist industries in order to meet the tourist demand. What is interesting here is that both countries were dictatorships, albeit of different nature, while tourists were coming from the liberal democracies in Western Europe and the social democracies of the so-called Nordic model in Northern Europe. A couple of words about the nature of political regimes in Spain and Romania. Spain was a far-right dictatorship born out of 1936-1939 civil war between the nationalists, an alliance of phalangists, conservatives, and monarchists led by Francisco Franco, and the Republicans that brought together the supporters of a popular front, socialists, communists, and syndicalists. Nationalists, led by Franco, won the civil war and installed a political regime that scholars define as resembling the ones in fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. The defeat of Axis powers left Spain quite isolated in Europe until 1953, when the Pact of Madrid, a military and economic agreement with the United States, was signed. Yet, the conservative Catholic Church was controlling all aspects of society to the extent that in the late 1940s, sunbathing in mixed gender groups was forbidden. Romania, on the other hand, was a socialist country in Eastern Europe under the Soviet Union's sphere of influence. Less isolated than Spain, Romania was a founding member of Comecon and of the Warsaw Pact. While in the 1950s this country was Soviet Union's utmost follower, in the mid-1960s its position began to change and Romania steered wheels towards the United States and Western Europe. In 1967, Romania was the first country member of the Warsaw Pact to establish official diplomatic relations with West Germany, despite protests from the socialist East Germany. In 1968, President de Gaulle visited Romania, while in 1969, US President Richard Nixon paid a visit as well. Rapprochement with the West did not mean Romania abandoned the Soviet bloc, though. Nicolae Ceausescu, who was the General Secretary of the Romanian Communist Party, favored a policy of independence both in relation to the Soviet Union and the West, with Romania as a middleman between the two, given the Cold War context. Otherwise, the Politburo of the Romanian Communist Party was at the heart of a decision-making process, while the economy was run through a centralized 5-year plan that covered all economic sectors, including tourism. The decision to develop international tourism came against the backdrop of increased tourist demand as political elites in both countries understood that tourism could bring along the coveted hard currencies, which could help with two feeble economies equalize their balance of payments and acquire economic modernization. Similarly, Romania and Spain decided to open their countries to foreign tourists from the West as an exercise in soft power because they wanted to prove the success of their respective political regimes and the improve in ordinary citizens' living standards. After the violent era of the 1940s and the 1950s, a so-called normalization occurred in both countries with an increase in consumption and individual freedom, but still less than in the liberal democracies in the West. Attracting foreign tourists to both countries was a long-term process that involved specific measures such as renewed travel regulations, the building of a tourist and transportation infrastructure, a strong tourist promotion, but also a fresh view on tourist management. Yet the arrival of foreign tourists produced a conundrum, as it also brought about new consumption habits and mores that enticed both Spaniards and Romanians, and that to a certain extent challenged the structure of the two quite traditional societies and political regimes. Hence, for both countries, the embracing of international tourism triggered a process of both top-down and bottom-up modernization. The top-down modernization meant an enhancement of tourist management and infrastructure, as well as better roads and more goods in the shops that benefited the local population as well, and not just the foreign tourists. At the bottom level, interactions between foreign tourists and Spaniards or Romanians brought about changes in mentalities and in consumption practices or mores, as well as various petty illegalities according to the legislation in place that the two states had to cope with despite being at odds with the rules imposed by, let's say, the church in Spain or the party and secret police in Romania. Just one example. In Romania, it was forbidden for tourist employees to receive gifts from foreign tourists, but this was quite a widespread practice, and many times authorities turned a blind eye to it because it was difficult to keep track on these exchanges. Also in Spain, bikinis were not allowed on the beach and the promenade area, but foreign tourists would many times ignore this rule and simply went away with it because Guardia Civil did not always enforce it as they were instructed not to bother the tourists. Next, we'll look at how the actual development of international tourism unfolded in Spain and Romania. We'll first look at the level of high policies, so the measures that state took in order to develop tourism in a specific political context, while in the second part we will examine how international tourism shaped everyday life, both in terms of official and unofficial consumption in the two countries. We'll start with Spain, and we should note that in the Spanish case, it was the geographical proximity to wealthier northwestern European countries and Western tourists' desire to find inexpensive and new tourist sites that propelled international tourism in the mid-1950s. In the beginning of a period, the Spanish state regarded international tourism as a temporary solution to overcome poverty and generalized economic crisis. One needs to remember that Spain was excluded from the Marshall Plan in 1947. So, similar to the Romanian case, where the priority was heavy industry, Spanish officials also hoped to develop mining and chemical industries. The change came in the late 1950s. Given tourists' interest, especially for the coastal regions, modern hotels began to be built. One of the first such hotels was Pesespada, which was built in 1959 in Torremolinos, a small village on Costa del Sol, in the southern part of Spain, historical Andalusia. This settlement turned just in a couple of years from a fisherman village into an international resort. A key moment in the embracing of international tourism was the Stabilization Plan of 1959 that opened Spain to foreign capital as the country was struggling with rampant inflation and economic crisis, followed by social tensions. In 1962, Manuel Fraga was appointed as the Minister of Information and Tourism, replacing the more conservative Ariel Salgado. Fraga, who was in his early 30s, regarded international tourism as an avenue for Spain. His charismatic figure helped Spain's promotion abroad. Just a quick example, in 1964, when a British tourist published a letter saying that she won't go back to Spain that summer, Fraga gave an interview to BBC attempting to convince British tourists to visit Spain again. His more concrete policies included the resuming of a hotel credit program, which was meant for the construction of hotels. It worked similar to European projects today. The prospective owner would put together a project application, making sure he or she has the resources to cover a part of a project, while the state would supply the rest of the necessary funding. Fraga's new policies and approach to tourism paid off. The number of foreign tourists increased in Spain from 83,568 in 1946 to 9,344 tourists in 1953 and to about 6 million in 1962 and furthermore to 15 million by 1970. Now we'll turn to the Romanian case. So in the Romanian case, the state was the one to take the initiative to develop international tourism in the late 1950s in the context of de-Stalinization in the Soviet Union and Khrushchev's interest in a competition with the West that involved consumer goods rather than military and political struggles, the so-called Khrushchev's thaw. In 1962, Romania developed the first plan for the promotion of tourism, and many materials were published in French, German, and English, which showed the intention to welcome Western tourists as well. Postcards and films were paid specific attention. Many of them depicted the newly built hotels in Mamaia, which was the main resort at the Black Sea coast in Romania. Hotels were built in a modernist style. They were all high-rise buildings in tone with architectural tendency in other European countries as well. You can see here some images, and what can we note is that the hotels are lined up along the beach line, and there are plenty of green spots and the promenade area between the hotels and the sandy beach for tourists to enjoy the view. Is quite welcoming. All these were architectural elements specific to other seaside resorts in southern or eastern Europe built during the 1950s and the 1960s, as this was synonym of modernity, and Romanian authorities wanted to portray Romania first and foremost as a modern country. These images are from the archive of Romanian Union of Architects, and they were just made available to a larger public. Also, in 1962, Romania won the first prize at the Paris Tourist Film Festival. In 1964, a number of Romanian restaurant and hotel specialists were sent to be trained in France because Romania needed tourist workers attuned with the newest cuisine and lodging tendencies in Western Europe. The state paid for their trip and instruction from the Council of Ministers Emergency Fund, which suggests the high importance of catching up with the West from this point of view. In 1968, Romania abolished visas for Western tourists traveling in organized groups. As a result, by 1968, some French guidebooks and Belgian travel magazines would insist on presenting Romania as part of European civilization and not so much as a country behind the Iron Curtain. In this context, the total number of foreign tourists increased from 200,000 in 1962 to 4.5 million in 1975 and further to 7 million in 1980. Well, We'll now talk about the limits of growth in both countries, and we'll start with Spain. First of all, one of the problems was fewer hotels and accommodation capacities than tourists. A 1964 report by the Trade Union of Hotel Workers, Sindicato de Hostelería, warned against the slow pace of hotel construction in Spain. It estimated that Spain lost $50 million only in 1963 because of a hotel's limited capacity. When hotel building took off, paradoxically, the most significant limitation of Spanish tourism came as a result of its speedy development, and because the hasty and at times disorderly rhythm of erecting new tourist establishments changed the landscape of many bucolic Spanish villages and towns. And here you can see a report of the Ministry of Information and Tourism, which complained about these changes in the following terms. And I quote, "Our coast is dotted with hotels and guest houses, all types of constructions, not always following the architectonic patterns of area or the rules of aesthetics. Our seaside became a swarming of buildings that have nothing to do with the idyllic image of our coast and villages." Another limitation came from the sanitary conditions, so sewerage system that was in existing. Most hotels and guest houses had only a septic tank. And at the National Tourism Assembly in 1964, the following complaint was put forth. And I quote, "The sanitation issue is a problem of socioeconomic infrastructure, which has to do with the education, living standards, and hygiene of every settlement." In Romania, one limitation came from the inflexibility of planned economy, but also the unreliability of signed contracts in the case of organized tourism. So what does this mean? For instance, a report from 1967 of a National Office for Tourism Carpathians, which was the main tourist agency in charge with development and managing of tourism in Romania, of state tourism in Romania. This report showed the inadvertencies of planned economy, explained to us, how this problem unfolded. And they're saying that on the one hand, the number of Western tourists that arrived in organized groups was lower than anticipated, right? Instead, more socialist tourists arrived on their own and were not able to find lodging because the hotel rooms were pre-booked for the tourists who were supposed to arrive in organized groups. At times, also poor tourist services and impersonal relations was also another limitation, and this resulted from the lack of experience with tourism and the lack of training, first of all. Next, you can see a fragment from an Austrian tourist letter who suggests some improvements in tourist services, and the letter was sent to the Council of Ministers of the government, and it was actually met with interest. As a side note, and the document said we should look into it. And here you have Austrian tourist letter who is saying the following. And I quote, "Because I want to consider your country despite the 20-year rupture as part of European civilization, I take the time to evaluate your tourism from the point of view of a tourist. I want to show what could be done to bring the resort to our standards in Mamaia to become a truly international tourist destination. First of all, flight attendants should speak some German. When tourists arrive at the hotel, at least someone from the management should welcome them. Human beings become completely impersonal when they are led like a crowd into the hotel. One never forgets she or he is just a number, an object." There are no entertainment options in Mamaia. Build some restaurants with Romanian food, wine and music. It's not good to make announcements in restaurants only in Romanian, like they do, for example, at Miorița, which was Romanian with Romanian cuisine and folk music, where 90% of the clients are Germans. So, and I end quote here. These were the suggestions and complaints made by the Austrian tourist letter in order to help Romanian authorities understand what foreign Western tourists actually want. So, next I will refer to another limitation, namely Ceausescu's heavy-handed policy. And one example from 1981, when the Ministry of Tourism sent a note to Ceausescu asking for a restaurant in Mamaia to remain open after 10 p.m., when, according to a newly issued law, all restaurants had to be closed. And this was made at the request of a group of Greek tourists who were celebrating Orthodox Easter in Romania. But Ceausescu's answer was no, to follow the law. So finally, and very importantly, another limitation in the Romanian case was the high prices. In the late 1970s, because the actual income from tourism failed to meet the regime's growing expectations, the Romanian government raised tourist prices. As a result, Romania became a slightly more expensive tourist destination than Spain and its neighbors Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. Because until 1982, vacation prices were calculated in dollars or Deutschmarks and not in the national currency of tourists' country of origins. In fact, vacations in Romania became even more expensive when converted to French francs or Italian liras. Now we will look at the everyday life level. And one thing to note is that despite the different economic approaches to and results of international tourism in Socialist Romania and Franco Spain, foreign tourists' day-to-day interactions with ordinary people changed consumption practices and opened the way for a more cosmopolitan way of life in both countries. That's one thing, and another important thing is that international tourism did contribute to modernization from below in both Socialist Romania and Franco's Spain. And here I show you how. So in Romania, for instance, official consumption soared, improved because of foreign tourists. And a 1967 guidebook, which was published by the Meridiane Publishing House in English, this was one of the main publishing houses in Romania, describes Romania, describes Constanța, the main city on the Romanian Black Sea coast, and called attention to one of the streets. It was called Stephen the Great, located in the city center, where, and I quote, "a great number of shops make it a convenient shopping area," and I end quote. So the arrival of foreign tourists determined the state to invest more in retail shops. And of course, this was something that benefited as well the Romanian citizens as well. And this sort of message, obviously present in a guidebook, invited foreign tourists to become shoppers in Romania in the 1960s. And in this context, images of shops and restaurants presented in guidebooks and tourist brochures and flyers tried to entice the curiosity of Western visitors. Now, while accessibility of consumer goods significantly improved in the 1960s in Romania compared to the 1950s, in the 80s there was a significant regression from this point of view. Already in 1979, the gasoline was rationed, and throughout the 1980s, all basic foodstuffs were rationed as well, while others became very difficult to find. In this context, the black market thrived, and foreign tourists became important suppliers of goods, as you actually learned from our reading for today about Romania. Now we will discuss the Spanish case, and here the availability of consumer goods increased after the stabilization plan of 1959 that opened the way for foreign investments and integrated Spain into the international market. This helped Spanish citizens overcome the difficult situation between the end of the Second World War and the mid-1950s, which was characterized by rationing, frequent queuing for foodstuffs, and lack of basic consumer goods. Just one example, one of the new goods that became widespread in the 1960s were the refrigerators. And in 1963, a magazine called Hostelería y Turismo, this was a magazine about tourism industry, included in its pages article about how to use such an appliance. And I quote, "One has to note that the use of a refrigerator does not improve the condition of foodstuff, but only preserves its freshness," and end quote. As I mentioned earlier, black market thrived in Romania, especially as of late 1970s, although it was also present before. It manifested itself, for instance, in the case of hard currencies, right, which was a lucrative business not just in Romania but also in Spain, and I will give you some examples. Very importantly, in Romania, possession of foreign currency was not allowed for Romanian citizens according to a 1960s law, unless this money was sent from abroad or there were people who worked abroad, and then of course they were paid in hard currencies, which were then transferred to Romanian foreign trade bank. Yet, Romanian citizens sometimes formed well-organized networks that dealt with either hard currencies or Romanian lei, because this was a lucrative business and could provide important amounts of money for the citizens who are engaged in these activities. Here I have an example taken from the C²DH. C²DH was the secret police in Romania, and presently its archives are available for researchers, and there are quite a lot of cases of such cases documented. One of them is about two brothers, one living in Austria and one in Romania, who in 1965, so a period that was considered more open in Romania in relation to connections with the West. So these two brothers carried out 200,000 lei, the equivalent of $18,000, through the border to sell it to potential foreign tourists to Romania, in Germany or Austria. This was a serious crime, and in fact the C²DH would have not found out about it if someone would not have reported on the two brothers. Okay, we'll move now to Spain, and here private possession of foreign currencies was also forbidden until 1948, and all exchanges had to take place through the Spanish Institute for Foreign Currency at an over-evaluated exchange rate. Between 1948 and 1959, a system of multiple exchange rates was adopted, which was quite complicated and did not fully eradicate the black market. In 1959, pesetas became fully convertible with the dollar and other currencies in Western Europe. Yet, despite this liberalization in the early 1960s, unofficial foreign currency exchanges still took place, especially in regions farther away from Madrid, mostly because of the long-term networks built prior 1959. One example, in 1961 in Palma de Mallorca, a certain Jimmy, who was the owner of a travel agency, would cash tourist dollars, checks, and pay them pesetas. As Jimmy's agency was closed, the story surfaced in the New York Herald Tribune. And according to a tourist, and I quote, he would cash your dollar checks, and so you wouldn't have to carry around a packet full of pesetas. He would hold your money for you and pay it out as requested. Then, last fall, for obscure reasons, the police closed Jimmy's shop. They confiscated all his cash, said to be more than 2 million pesetas, even though they were informed much of it belonged to tourists, not to Jimmy. Like others, I engaged a Mallorcan lawyer, but to no avail. It was more than 6 months ago, but I'm still waiting for the Palma police to disgorge my 15,000 pesetas. End quote. This incident was not isolated, and it shows how some Spanish citizens, similar to the Romanian example, used the presence of foreign tourists to go around the state and obtain illicit material gains. As both states wanted to have a monopoly on foreign currency transactions, these sorts of endeavors were illegal. To a certain extent, these examples suggest the limits of both states in controlling these activities and what they considered the improper relations between the citizens of the two states and foreign tourists. To conclude, this lecture aimed to explain how and why two different types of dictatorships, far-right Francoist Spain and communist Romania, choose to develop international tourism, an activity that otherwise exposed the two states and their citizens to the curious eye of foreign tourists. The main reason was economic because both Spain and Romania wanted to acquire hard currencies in order to equalize their balance of payments. With the money obtained from tourism, Spain and Romania wanted to buy modern technologies which could help them modernize their economies. Additionally, it was part of the two countries' cultural diplomacy that aimed at presenting the two societies as modern and successful despite being different from the core liberal democracies in Northwestern Europe. The elephant in the room is, of course, the fact that Spain was more successful, so to speak, with international tourism. If we look at the sheer number of tourists and the revenues they delivered, and the question is obviously why didn't Romania perform in a similar way? Was it because of a difference in political regimes, with Romania having a planned economy and Spain gradually turning into a capitalist economy in the 1960s? Well, the short answer is not really, because the state had a strong grip on tourism industry in Spain as well, while in Romania there were some attempts to decentralize tourism management. The answer to this riddle stays in the decision-making process in each country. While in Spain it was the Ministry of Information and Tourism that made most decisions regarding tourism, in Romania it was the Politburo of the Communist Party's Central Committee, um, which made decisions based on studies put together by the Ministry of Tourism and its agencies. Yet the political actors did not always pay enough attention to these studies, and as of late 1970s, in fact now Nicolae Ceausescu's heavy-handed policy affected tourism growth, as some decisions were based on his personal biases. Similarly, the tourist personnel's lack of motivation, excessive bureaucracy, and the lack of means of entertainment contributed to making international tourism less successful in Romania. Also, the Romanian authorities' prioritization of Western tourists against the tourists from the neighboring socialist countries led to waste of resources when tourists from capitalist countries arrived in lower numbers than expected. In the meanwhile, rooms in luxury hotels remained unoccupied, while tourists from Eastern Europe were assigned to lower class lodging, which of course resulted in dissatisfaction. However, the most important aspect that led to the limited growth of international tourism in Romania was the international context. Spain began its tourism development in the late 1950s, while Romania took off in early to mid 1960s and reached its peak in the late 1970s. But the 1970s were dominated by the two oil shocks in 1973 and 1979, and hence the circulation of Western tourists who traveled both by car and by plane was affected. Whereas Romania's geographical position further away from the tourist countries of origin worked against it as transportation costs became higher both for tourists in organized groups and for those who traveled on individual basis. Last but not least, the arrival of foreign tourists had unintended consequences in both countries. Ordinary citizens had access to various commodities or engaged in petty illegalities that put to the test authorities in both states. Yet, as Spain did less to control interactions between foreigners and Spaniards and tolerated consumption, this could be one of the explanations for the smoother end of the Francoist regime in Spain in 1975 when Franco died in his own bed, while in Romania, the lack of consumer goods delegitimized Ceausescu's regime and may have led to the 1989 revolution and Ceausescu's own violent end. To wrap it up, what do we gain intellectually if we compare international tourism in Socialist Romania and Franco Spain? Well, first of all, we bring to the fore similarities and connections between Eastern and Southern Europe in the post-war period that went unnoticed thus far, as existing scholarship on the Cold War has mostly paid attention to East-West contacts and entanglements. Secondly, we examine the globalization process that international tourism entailed from the perspective of two different types of dictatorships in countries located in the European periphery. Third, we reflect on the relationship between state and citizens in two different types of dictatorships in post-war period, with an eye on the agency ordinary citizens attained because of the two states opening towards foreign tourists. Well, thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the in-class discussion.